Part 1. The house next door had been quiet for months. For Clara, a woman who had spent the last 40 years of her life surrounded by the sounds of scales and sonatas, the silence from the big house with the overgrown lilac bush was a lonely one. Her own house, a neat cottage with a wide front window, felt too large now. The piano in her living room, a beautiful old upright, sat mostly closed. It was too quiet. So she noticed everything when the new family moved in on a rainy Tuesday in September. She watched from her window as the moving truck grumbled into the driveway. A man, tall and looking a bit worn at the edges, directed the movers with a quiet efficiency. He had a kind face, she thought, but his shoulders were set in a way that spoke of a heavy weight. And then she saw the boy. He was small, maybe 7 or 8, with hair the color of dark sand. He held his father's hand tightly. What struck Clara and made her lean a little closer to the glass was how the boy moved. His steps were careful, measured. He didn't look at the new house or the big tree in the front yard. His head was tilted, as if listening to the world in a different way. His father guided him gently, his voice a low murmur, pointing out the step up to the porch. The boy's eyes, a clear, pale blue, were open, but they didn't focus on anything Clara could see. She understood then. The boy was blind. A few days passed. Clara saw the father, whose name she learned was David, leaving for work early each morning, his tie sometimes crooked. She saw him coming home in the evening, always holding his son's hand, always speaking in that same calm, patient tone. She learned the boy's name was Leo. She began to piece together their life. It was a life of quiet routine, of careful navigation. She saw the love between them, a thick, sturdy rope that guided them through each day. But she also saw the exhaustion on David's face, and a shadow of something else, a deep worry that never seemed to leave his eyes. Then came the afternoon of the sound. Clara was in her garden, pulling weeds from around her rose bushes. The air was warm, and the windows of the house next door were open to let in the breeze. That's when she heard it. It wasn't music, not really. It was a series of plinks and plonks, a chaotic, joyful noise. It came from a cheap, tinny-sounding electronic keyboard. But within that noise, Clara's trained ear heard something else. She stopped digging and listened. There was a rhythm to it. The child Leo wasn't just hitting keys at random. He was listening to the sounds he made. A high note, then a pause. 2 low notes together. Then he'd repeat the high note, searching for it again. He was exploring, trying to build something. He played a little cluster of notes that, by pure chance, made a sad, sweet little chord. Clara found herself smiling. She heard the pure curiosity in it. It was the sound of a mind reaching out, trying to understand a language made of vibration and pitch. She heard it again the next day, and the day after that. It became the soundtrack to her afternoons. The clumsy, earnest exploring. Sometimes she would hum along softly from her garden, matching the notes he was trying to find. She felt a strange connection to this little boy she had never met. The piano in her own living room seemed to call out, feeling neglected. Her chance to speak came at the mailbox on the corner. David was there, pulling out a stack of bills and advertisements. Leo stood beside him, one small hand resting on the metal post of the mailbox, feeling the sun's warmth on its surface. "Good afternoon," Clara said, her voice friendly. David looked up, a little startled, then smiled. "Oh, hello. You must be from next door. I'm David. This is Leo." "I'm Clara," she said, nodding. She looked at Leo. "I've heard you playing your keyboard, young man. You have quite an ear." Leo's face turned toward the sound of her voice. He didn't smile, but his expression was one of serious attention. David's smile, however, faltered. That shadow Clara had seen before passed over his face, quick but deep. "Oh, that," David said, his voice suddenly tired. "He loves making noise with that thing. It's his favorite toy." "It's more than noise," Clara said gently. "I was a piano teacher for many years. I can hear him listening. He's trying to find patterns." David looked down at his son, his love for the boy clear and painful on his face. He sighed, a sound that seemed to come from his very bones. "He does. Music is. It's his world. He remembers every song he hears on the radio. He can tell you what instrument is playing. But—" He trailed off, shaking his head. "But what?" Clara asked softly. "But that's all it can be," David said, his voice dropping as if sharing a shameful secret. "A hobby. A toy. I looked into real lessons once. It's impossible." He rubbed a hand over his face. "The cost is one thing. I'm a single dad. It's tight. But the real problem is nobody knows how to teach him. I called 3 teachers. They were nice, but they all said the same thing. They've never worked with a blind child. They wouldn't know where to start. They said he'd need special materials, special methods. It's not their fault. It's just not possible." He said the last words with a finality that broke Clara's heart. He had accepted this as a fact of life, another wall his son would have to live behind. Leo stood quietly, his hand still on the post. He was listening to every word. A feeling rose up in Clara, fierce and sudden. It was a feeling she hadn't felt since she'd closed her teaching studio. It was purpose. It was defiance. She looked at David's resigned face and then at Leo's attentive, quiet one. "I could teach him," she said. The words were out before she could think them through. David stared at her, confused. "What?" "I could teach Leo piano. On my piano." David shook his head, a sad, gentle refusal already forming on his lips. "Mrs. Clara, that's incredibly kind. But you heard me." "The cost, for free," Clara interrupted, her voice firm. "No cost, not a penny." David was speechless. He looked at this small, sharp-eyed woman as if she'd just spoken in another language. "Why? Why would you do that?" This was the harder part. Clara had her reasons that sat in her own heart like stones. But she couldn't explain them. Not yet. Maybe not ever. "Because I have a piano, and it's gathering dust," she said, which was true, but not the whole truth. "And because I heard him play. He deserves a chance to make real music." She took a breath. "But there's one condition." "A condition?" David asked, wary now. "It has to be our secret," Clara said. She held up a hand as he began to protest. "Just between us. You, me, and Leo. No one else needs to know. We'll arrange the times. He can come to my house after school. But we don't talk about it. Not to friends, not to family. It's just ours." David was completely baffled. "I don't understand." "A secret? Why?" Clara met his gaze. Her eyes, a faded blue like winter sky, were unreadable but steady. "That's my condition. Take it or leave it." She saw the war in his mind. Suspicion fought with desperate hope. He looked at Leo, who had now turned his head fully toward Clara, his small face alight with a question he wasn't asking. The hope won. "Okay," David said, the word coming out in a rush of breath. "Okay, if you're serious." "If you're sure." "I am," Clara said. She finally smiled at Leo. "How about you come over tomorrow, Leo? Around 4 o'clock? We'll introduce you to a real piano." Leo didn't smile back, but he gave a single, solemn nod. David just stood there, holding his mail, looking like a man who had just been thrown a lifeline, but wasn't sure if the rope was strong enough to hold. That night, in her quiet house, Clara sat on the bench in front of her piano. She didn't open the lid. She just placed her hands, now lightly traced with veins and age spots, on the smooth, cool wood. She thought of the little boy next door, living in a world of darkness and sound. She thought of the impossible task she had just given herself. And she thought of her own secret, the one that made this all so urgent, so necessary. A secret that made every minute count. She had made a promise. Now she had to figure out how to keep it. She had to learn how to teach music to someone who could never see the black and white keys, the notes on a page, or the teacher's guiding hands. She would have to build a new language. And she would have to do it in secret, before time ran out for all of them. The following afternoon, at 4 o'clock sharp, a soft knock sounded on Clara's front door. She opened it to find David and Leo standing on her porch. Leo held his father's hand, his face turned slightly upward, catching the last of the day's sun on his skin. In his other hand, he clutched the small red plastic keyboard. Come in, Clara said, stepping back. Her living room was warm and full of soft light. Books filled the shelves, and photographs of former students in recital dresses and suits smiled from the walls. But the centerpiece, the thing that took up most of the space, was the piano. David guided Leo inside. The boy's head tilted immediately. He was listening to the new space, the tick of a clock on the mantel, the creak of the floorboard under his feet, the different way sound moved in here compared to his own home. Leo, this is Mrs. Clara, David said, his voice a little tight with nerves. Hello, Leo, Clara said. She didn't reach to pat his head or take his hand. She just spoke to him directly, like she would to any new student. Leo gave that same serious nod. Hello. Then, after a pause, he said, Your house smells like lemons and old books. Clara laughed, a real surprised sound. It does. The lemons are from polish for the furniture. The old books are just me. She saw David looking at the piano, then at her, his eyes full of unasked questions. She knew what he was thinking. Asterisk, how is this going to work? Asterisk, David, you can leave him with me, Clara said, her tone leaving no room for argument. Come back in 45 minutes. David hesitated, looking down at his son. You sure, buddy? Leo had let go of his father's hand. He was still listening, his body oriented toward the big, quiet presence at the piano. Yes, he said, simple and sure. With a last worried glance, David left. The door clicked shut, and it was just the two of them, the old teacher and the small boy, in a room full of quiet music waiting to happen. All right, Leo, Clara said, clapping her hands once softly. First rule. We leave that toy at the door. She walked over and gently took the plastic keyboard from his hand, setting it on a side table. This, she said, leading him by the elbow the few steps to the piano bench, is the real thing. She sat and patted the space beside her. He climbed up. The bench was wide and smooth. Go ahead, she whispered. Touch it. Leo's small hands came up. His fingers trembled for a second, then made contact with the lid of the piano. It was cool and hard and shiny. He slid his hands across it, then down the front until his fingertips found the gap where the keys were. He traced the lip of the keyboard. Now, Clara said softly. She reached over and lifted the heavy fallboard, the inside mechanism giving a soft thunk and whir. The keys were revealed, a long river of ivory white and ebony black. A small sound escaped Leo's lips, a gasp of pure wonder. He stretched his hands out, but stopped just before touching the keys, as if they were something holy. It's okay, Clara said. It's meant to be touched. His fingers came down, first on one white key in the middle. A clear, round note sang out in the quiet room. Middle C. Leo, flinched at the sound, then smiled, a real, wide smile that transformed his whole face. He pressed it again. Then he found the note next to it. And the next, for a few minutes, Clara just let him explore. He moved up and down, his touch surprisingly gentle. He discovered the black keys, the little raised islands. He pressed 2 at the same time, then 3, listening to the clash and blend of sounds. Clara watched his face. He wasn't just hitting keys. He was listening. His head would cock to one side. His eyebrows would pull together in concentration. He was building a map in his mind, a landscape of pitch and feel. "Okay," she said finally. "Enough touring. Time for some work." She had spent all night thinking about this. There would be no sheet music, no saying, "Put your thumb on middle C" from a book. She had to build the piano inside his mind first. "Close your eyes," she said. "I always do," Leo said, without a hint of sadness. It was just a fact. Clara smiled. "Good. Then we start even. Put your hands flat on the keys, right in the middle." He did. His hands were small, but his fingers were long for his age. Pianist's hands, she thought. "Feel this," she said. She took his right hand and guided his index finger to a black key, then the one next to it. 2 black keys, together, like a little porch roof for a little house. She let him feel the shape. "Now slide your finger off the porch, down to the white key right in front, tucked under the roof." His finger found the key F. "Good. That's a home note. It's called F now. Let's find the other little house." She moved his hand to the next group of 3 black keys. 3 black keys. A bigger porch for a bigger house. Again, she had him slide off the front. "That white key is C, your other home note." She spent the whole lesson on this. Not playing songs, but building geography. The little house and the big house of black keys. The feeling of the smooth, cool white keys. The different sounds the low notes made, like a big, friendly bear walking through the forest, and the high notes, like a bird calling from the very top of a tree. She taught him by touch and by story. She would play a simple 5-note pattern, then take his hands and place them over hers so he could feel the muscles in her fingers move, feel the gentle press and release of each key. He would feel the vibration travel from the piano, through her hands, into his. Then he would try, his small hands stretching to find the same places. He was a fast learner. His memory for sound was incredible. If she played a short pattern twice, he could almost always replicate it, his fingers searching carefully for the right porch to slide down from. The 45 minutes flew by. When a knock came at the door, Leo jumped, startled out of his deep focus. David came in, his face anxious. He looked at his son, expecting maybe frustration or tears. He saw instead a boy sitting tall on the piano bench, his face flushed with effort, and something else, a kind of peaceful happiness. "So? How did it go?" David asked, looking from Leo to Clara. Leo turned his head toward his father's voice. "The low notes are a bear," he said seriously, "and the high notes are a bird. And my home notes are under the little porch and the big porch." David looked utterly confused. Clara just gave a small, secret smile. "He did very well," Clara said. "He listens. Really listens. That's the most important thing." As they left, Leo reached out and carefully felt for the edge of the doorframe before stepping onto the porch. David mouthed, "Thank you," to Clara over his head. She nodded. The lessons became their secret ritual. Every Tuesday and Thursday at 4 o'clock. David would drop Leo off, and for 1 hour, the old living room became a different world. Clara threw away every rule she'd ever used. She taught him scales by calling them stairs, going up and down. She taught him chords by calling them families of notes that liked to sing. Together, she recorded simple melodies on an old cassette recorder so he could listen between lessons and practice finding the notes. She discovered his talent wasn't just a good ear. It was a deep, natural feel for rhythm and emotion. He couldn't see her face, so he learned to listen to her breathing, to the shift of her weight on the bench, to understand when a phrase should be soft or strong. One afternoon, she played a short, sad little piece for him. When she finished, there was a quiet moment. "That song feels like when you wait for someone and they're late," Leo said, his small hands resting in his lap. Clara felt a lump rise in her throat. He wasn't just hearing notes. He was hearing the heart of the music. That was something you couldn't teach. It just was. She began to give him more. Little exercises turned into real, simple songs. He learned a folk tune, then a simplified line from a piece by Mozart. His confidence grew. His careful touch became more sure. At home, David noticed the changes. Leo was calmer. He would hum constantly, little bits of the melodies he was learning. He would sit on the couch, his fingers moving silently on his knees as if they were on keys, practicing. The clumsy plinks from the toy keyboard were replaced by a focused silence. A mind at work. But David kept the secret. He didn't ask for demonstrations. He saw the light in his son's face after each lesson, and that was enough. He trusted the mysterious, serious woman next door. One Thursday, Clara introduced something new. She placed a small, round candlestick holder made of smooth, cool brass on the piano lid above middle C. "This," she told Leo, guiding his hand to touch it, "is your lighthouse. If you ever get lost on the piano C, you just reach up, find the lighthouse, and you know you are right in the middle of everything. It will always guide you home." Leo's fingers traced the shape of the brass holder. He nodded, committing its feel and position to memory. It was an anchor point in his dark world. As the weeks turned into months, the secret music grew more beautiful. But another secret was growing too, one that Clara held close. Sometimes during a lesson, her hands would stiffen for a moment. She would have to shake them out when she thought Leo wasn't paying attention. Sometimes a word would escape her, and she'd have to pause, searching for it. She blamed it on being old and tired. But a fear, cold and quiet, had begun to grow in her own heart. It was a race against a clock only she could hear ticking, and she was determined that Leo would learn to hear the music before the silence came for her. The secret rhythm of the lessons settled into the fabric of their weeks. Tuesday and Thursday afternoons became the quiet heartbeat of both houses. For Leo, the world was starting to make a new kind of sense, organized around sound and touch and the gentle, firm voice of his teacher. He no longer needed to be guided to the bench. He would walk into Clara's living room, his hand lightly brushing the doorframe, then the back of the armchair, navigating the familiar path until his legs touched the piano bench. He would sit, his hands finding the lighthouse, the cool brass candlestick holder, to orient himself, and then he would place his fingers on the keys, ready to begin. The music was growing. The simple folk songs and five-finger exercises had given way to real pieces. Clara had chosen a short, beautiful composition by a composer named Bergmüller. It had a rolling left hand that sounded like a gentle stream and a sweet, singing melody in the right hand. She taught it to him, not measure by measure, but phrase by phrase, singing the notes, letting him feel her hands play it, then breaking it down into small, learnable sections. Leo lived with the piece. He practiced the phrases in his mind while lying in bed. He tapped the rhythms on the kitchen table until his father asked him if he was sending a Morse code message. The cassette recorder Clara had given him was his constant companion, the worn tape clicking and whirring as he listened to her play the piece over and over, committing the waterfall of sound to his incredible memory. At home, David watched this transformation with a heart full of a quiet, bewildered gratitude. The little boy who used to move with careful uncertainty now had a purpose in his step when he went next door. There was a new confidence in the set of his shoulders. David would sometimes stand in his own kitchen, listening to the faint, muffled sound of the piano through the walls. He couldn't make out the notes, but he could hear the pattern, the stop and start of practice, the repetition of a difficult section, and then, sometimes, a flowing run of music that made him stop washing dishes just to listen. It was proof of a world being built next door, a world he was not part of, and he was okay with that. The results were all he needed to see. Then came the Tuesday David's meeting was canceled. He came home 2 hours early. The house was quiet. He made himself a cup of coffee and sat at the kitchen table, enjoying the unusual silence. And that's when he heard it. It wasn't the muffled, broken sounds of practice. It was music, clear, delicate, and full of feeling. It was the piece Leo had been working on, but it was no longer a collection of notes. It was a whole story. The left hand truly did ripple like water. The right hand melody sang out, sad and hopeful, all at once. David stood up as if pulled by a string. He walked to the wall he shared with Clara's house and put his hand flat against it. He closed his eyes. His son was doing this. His little boy, who lived in darkness, was creating this beauty. The emotion of it crashed over David's immense pride, followed by a sharp, painful twist of guilt. Why was this a secret? Why did this incredible thing have to be hidden away? He felt a sudden, fierce desire to shout it from the rooftops, to call everyone and say, "Listen. Listen to what my son can do." The music ended on a soft, resolved chord. The silence that followed felt holy. David realized there were tears on his cheeks. He wiped them away, feeling foolish and overwhelmed. He didn't go next door. He couldn't. The pact was the pact. But the secret now felt like a heavy stone in his pocket. Meanwhile, in Clara's living room, a different secret was becoming harder to hide. Beautiful. "Leo," Clara said, her voice a little thicker than usual. "That phrase needs to be softer, like you're telling me a secret. Try it again, from the top of the page." There was no page, of course. It was just what she always said. Leo nodded, his fingers poised. He began again. Clara watched his hands, but her own hands, resting in her lap, began to tremble. It was a slight, fluttering movement, like a leaf in a breeze. She clenched them into fists to make it stop. As Leo played, she tried to say, "Good, now slow the stream down a little," but the words came out tangled. "Good, now slow the stream." She couldn't find the word down. It was just gone. Her mind felt foggy for a second. "Slow the stream, Clara?" Leo asked, his fingers pausing. He was acutely sensitive to changes in her voice. "Yes," she said, forcing the word out clearly. "Slow the stream. The left hand. Make it slower." He obeyed, his brow furrowed in concentration. The tremor in her hands subsided. The fog lifted. But the scare was cold and real in her chest. It was happening more often. The little stumbles. The weakness in her fingers that wasn't just arthritis. She had been to the doctor. She had heard the words, progressive neurological condition. She had seen the MRI scans. There was a name for it, a long, clinical name that meant one thing. The pathways between her brain and her hands were slowly going silent. The very thing that made her who she was, a teacher, a musician, was being taken away. She looked at Leo, so focused, so trusting. He was learning the language faster than she'd dreamed possible. But a clock was ticking loudly in her ears. She had to go faster. She had to give him as much as she could before the connection failed completely. The next lesson was worse. She was demonstrating a new chord progression. her hands moving through a familiar pattern. Midway, her right hand simply forgot. The fingers fumbled, striking a clash of wrong notes that rang out in the quiet room. Leo jerked back, startled by the harsh sound. What was that? Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. Nothing, she said, too quickly. I was just showing you what it sounds like when you're careless. Don't be careless. The lie tasted bitter in her mouth. She saw the doubt on his face. He might not see, but he perceived everything. He knew her voice, her rhythms. He knew something was off. Are you okay, Clara? He asked, his small voice full of a concern that was too old for him. I'm just tired. My boy, she said, and this, at least, was true. She was so tired. Old bones get tired. Now your turn. Listen. She played the progression correctly this time, her hands obeying through sheer force of will, but the cracks were showing. The perfect secret world they had built was developing tiny fractures. Leo would sometimes pause, his head tilted not toward the music, but toward her, listening to her breathe, listening for the catch in her voice. David, next door, listened to the beautiful music with a new and painful understanding, feeling both wonder and a growing sense that the secret was a fragile, unsustainable thing. The crisis point came on a Thursday. Leo arrived, knocking softly as he always did. Clara called for him to come in, but her voice was slurred, the words running together. He pushed the door open and walked in. Clara was sitting in her armchair, not on the bench. The room was dim. She hadn't opened the curtains. Leo, she said, trying to smile. The left side of her mouth didn't seem to move quite right. Are we having lesson today? He asked, standing in the middle of the room, uncertain. Double quotes, yes, of course, she said, but she made no move to get up. Her left hand lay in her lap, the fingers curled inward. Just give me a moment. My old bones are sleepy. Leo took a small step forward. He was frightened. This was wrong. Clara was never in the chair. She was always at the piano, waiting, her voice clear and firm. Clara? He said. He moved toward the sound of her breathing, which seemed uneven. He reached out, and his hand found her arm on the chair rest. It felt stiff. Panic, cold and sharp, rose in the boy's throat. He remembered the number, the one she had made him memorize on his Braille watch, pressing his fingers over the raised dots again and again. For emergencies only, she had said. If you ever need your father and can't find the door. He stumbled back to the front door, fumbling with the latch. He got it open and ran across the 2 yards, his feet knowing the way. He burst into his own house, calling for his dad, his voice tight with fear. David was there in an instant, dropping to his knees. Leo? What's wrong? It's Clara, Leo gasped, grabbing his father's shirt. Something's wrong. Her voice is broken. She can't get up. You have to come. David didn't ask another question. He ran next door, Leo's hand clutched in his. He found Clara in the chair, trying and failing to push herself up. One side of her face was sagging. The secret was over. The next few hours were a blur of noise and harsh light. David called the ambulance. The paramedics came, their voices loud and full of questions Clara couldn't answer clearly. Leo sat on the bottom step of the staircase, his hands pressed over his ears, trying to block out the chaos. He heard the clatter of the stretcher, the beep of a machine, the mumbled words from Clara that made no sense. David tried to shield him from it, but there was no shielding him from the fear. In the air. David rode in the ambulance, leaving Leo with a kind neighbor from down the street. The hospital was a world of cold smells and echoing footsteps. Clara was wheeled away through swinging doors, and David was left in a waiting room with plastic chairs and a buzzing, Television. He called the neighbor to check on Leo. He's just sitting on the couch, very quiet, the neighbor said. He won't say a word. David's heart ached. He knew that quiet. It was Leo's world closing in, trying to process something too big to understand. A doctor finally came out, a young woman with a tired but kind face. Are you family? She asked. David hesitated. She's my neighbor. There's no one else. I'm all she has right now. The doctor nodded, accepting this. She's had a TIA, a transient ischemic attack. Like a small stroke, but the symptoms are temporary. They're already improving. But it's a major warning sign. It's caused by and connected to the underlying progressive condition she has. You know about that? David felt a chill. No, I didn't. The doctor looked at her chart. She has a degenerative neurological disorder. It's been progressing for some time. It affects motor control, speech, coordination. The TIA is a complication. She's going to need significant support. She can't live alone anymore. David sat down heavily on the plastic chair. The secret had layers, he realized. And this was the deepest, darkest one. He thought of the fumbled words, the trembling hands she'd blamed on being old and tired. He felt a wave of guilt for not pushing harder, and then a surge of awe for what she had been doing in spite of it all. Can I see her? He asked. Clara was in a room that smelled of antiseptic. She looked small in the big bed, connected to a monitor by wires. The droop in her face was less pronounced, but she looked exhausted and very old. Her eyes, however, were clear. They found David as he walked in, and filled with a deep shame. David, she said, her words slow but understandable. Leo, is he? He's safe. He's with Mrs. Peterson. He's worried about you. David pulled a chair close to the bed. The hum of the hospital was all around them. Clara, why didn't you tell me? Tears welled up in her eyes and spilled over, tracing lines down her wrinkled cheeks. She didn't try to wipe them away. Tell you what? She whispered. That I was falling apart? That my hands... These hands? She looked down at them, lying useless on the white sheet. That they were betraying me? So you could feel sorry for me? So you would look at me with pity instead of seeing me as a teacher? But the lessons... You were pushing yourself so hard. That was the point, she said, her voice gaining a sliver of its old strength. Don't you see? For 40 years, I was Clara the piano teacher. That was who I was. Then this thing started happening. I had to close my studio. I was just Clara the old lady, sitting in a quiet house, waiting to become a burden. She took a shaky breath. And then I heard your boy. I heard him trying to make music with that toy. I heard the want in it. And I thought, this is my last chance. Not to be a saint, not to be a hero, but to be me again. One last time. She looked directly at him, her gaze fierce through the tears. I needed to teach someone who didn't need to see my shaking hands, who didn't need to read the notes I could no longer write, who only needed to feel the music. He didn't see a sick old woman. He just heard a teacher. He felt the music through my hands while they still worked. That was the gift, David, not for him. For me. David finally understood. The secrecy wasn't about shame or mystery. It was about preservation. She had created a small, perfect world where her illness didn't exist, where she was still whole. She had used the last of her wholeness to build a new world for his son. Oh, Clara, he said, his own eyes stinging. He reached out and took one of her hands. It was cool and frail. You gave him everything. She shook her head weakly. Not everything. Not yet. There's so much more he needs to learn. The despair crept back into her voice. And now, look at me. I can't even pour a cup of tea. How can I teach him?" They sat in silence for a moment, the truth hanging between them. The secret was out, and the beautiful makeshift arrangement was over. Clara would have to go to a facility, a place where they could care for her. The piano would sit silent again. Then David straightened up. He squeezed her hand gently. "We're not done," he said, his voice firm. Clara looked at him, confused. "You're his teacher," David said. "That hasn't changed. You've built the foundation. You've given him the language. We'll find a way to keep going." "How?" She breathed. "I don't know yet," David admitted. "But I'll figure it out. You just focus on getting stronger. Even if it's just from a chair. Even if it's just with words. You're not just my neighbor anymore, Clara. You're family. And we take care of family." 2 days later, Clara was moved to a rehabilitation center. It was a bright place, but it wasn't home. Her room had a window and a small, uncomfortable chair. Her piano, her books, her lighthouse candlestick holder were all miles away. David brought Leo to visit. The boy was hesitant, nervous of the new smells and sounds. But when Clara spoke, his shoulders relaxed. "Come here, my boy," she said from her chair. He walked toward her voice until his legs touched hers. She put her good hand, the right one was still weak and uncooperative, on his head. "No tears," she said softly. "We have work to do." From her bag, David pulled out the old cassette recorder and a new blank tape. He also pulled out a small, portable keyboard. It wasn't a real piano, but it had full-sized, touch-sensitive keys. "What's this?" Leo asked, his fingers finding the edge of the plastic keyboard on the bed. "This," Clara said, "is our new classroom. Now sit. I have a new piece for you." David helped set it up. Leo sat on the edge of the bed, the keyboard on his lap. Clara, from her chair, could no longer guide his hands. So she used her voice and the recorder. "This piece is by a man named Inaughty," she said. "It's built on patterns. It's like a river over stones. Listen." She had recorded the entire piece at home, before the hospital, in one last marathon session when she knew time was short. She'd played it slowly, perfectly, fighting through the stiffness to get it right. David pressed play. A beautiful, repetitive, haunting melody filled the small room. Leo's face went still, his whole being focused on the sound. He listened to the loop of notes, the left hand's pulsing chords, the right hand's melancholy tune. "It's sad, but it's strong," Leo murmured when it ended. "Exactly," Clara said, her voice tired but full of pride. "Now we learn it. Not all at once. One stone at a time. David will help you find the starting notes. I will tell you the story of the music." And so a new routine was born. David, using the crude map of the piano Clara had taught him, the little porch and the big porch would help Leo find the first-hand position on the portable keyboard. Clara, from her chair, would describe the emotion of the next phrase. "This part is like remembering something happy from a long time ago," she'd say. Or, "Here, the river hits a rock, and splashes make it louder, sharper." She was teaching him to play from the inside out, to understand the feeling and let the fingers find the way. It was harder. It was slower. There were frustrations. But the connection was still there, stretched thin by circumstance, but unbroken. Before they left that first visit, Clara gave Leo the old cassette tape. "This is your map now," she told him. "Listen, learn it. Next time, you play the first stone for me." As David led Leo out, the boy held the tape tightly to his chest. The music wasn't in the sunny living room anymore. It was in a sterile room that smelled of cleaning products. The teacher was in a chair, not on a bench. But the music was still there. It was smaller, and it was a struggle, but it was alive. The secret was gone, But something stronger had begun to grow in its place, a determination seen on a father's face, a focus heard in a boy's fingers on keys, and a fierce, enduring love in an old teacher's heart. The visits to the rehabilitation center became their new normal. Every Saturday afternoon, David and Leo would make the journey across town. The portable keyboard, with its headphone jack, was a constant companion. The music was quieter now, contained to the small room and the private world inside Leo's headphones, but it was persistent. Clara's condition did not improve. It stabilized, but the weakness on her left side remained. The fine control in her fingers was gone for good. She would never play again. This truth sat in the room with them, a silent, sorrowful guest. But Clara refused to let it be the focus. Her mind was as sharp as ever, and her ears were now her most powerful tool. She became a conductor, a guide, a storyteller of sound. Since she could no longer demonstrate, her instructions became more vivid, more rooted in feeling. "That phrase isn't a question, Leo," she would say from her chair by the window. "It's an answer. Play it like you're sure, like you're nodding your head." Or, "The left hand here, it's not just chords. It's footsteps walking away in the snow. Make them crisp. Make them lonely." Leo, attuned to every nuance in her voice, learned to translate her words into touch. David watched, often from the corner of the room, as his son's face would shift from frustration to dawning understanding. He saw how Leo would play a line, then turn his head instinctively toward Clara, waiting for her verdict. A soft yes from her was like sunshine breaking through clouds. The I naughty piece, Leond, was their mountain. They climbed it measure by measure. It was hard. Without Clara's hands to guide him, Leo had to trust his memory, his mental map of the keyboard, and the feeling Clara described. There were days of wrong notes, of rhythmic stumbles that made Leo slump in frustration. His small hands curling into fists. On one such day, Clara spoke softly. "Stop." Leo stopped. "Do you know why this is hard?" she asked. "Because I can't see," Leo said, the old bitterness touching his voice for the first time in months. "No," Clara said, her tone leaving no room for argument. "That has nothing to do with it. It's hard because it's supposed to be hard. It's hard for everyone. The difficulty is the point. The struggle is where the music is born. Now, again. From the top. And this time, don't play the notes. Play the feeling of water." Leo sat up straight. He took a deep breath. He began again. And something shifted. The notes weren't perfect, but they were connected. They flowed. They had a feeling. David, watching, felt a lump form in his throat. She wasn't just teaching him piano. She was teaching him how to overcome doubt at home. The secret was now a proud, open project. David turned the small, sunlit dining room into a practice space. He sold a few things he didn't need, and with some careful saving, bought a decent second-hand digital piano. It had weighted keys that felt almost real. He mounted the brass lighthouse candlestick holder above middle C dot. He also began to make calls. He told the story, not for pity, but for possibility. He called the local school for the visually impaired. He called music charities. He was politely passed from person to person. Many were sympathetic, but resources were thin. Then, a teacher from the school mentioned a name, an older professor at the community college, semi-retired, who had once pioneered music theory programs for blind students decades ago. He was hard to reach, but worth a try. David left a message, explaining briefly about Leo and Clara. He didn't expect much. Meanwhile, spring turned to early summer. Clara was preparing to move to a permanent assisted living home. The finality of it hung over their next visit. She was quieter, tired. "I have something for you, Leo," she said. Her voice was thin but clear. From the drawer of her bedside table, She pulled out her old cassette recorder. But she also pulled out a small, new digital voice recorder. "This one is easier," she said, placing it in his hands. "David will show you. On it. I've recorded the rest. Not just Leon, other pieces. Some Bergmuller, a little Mozart, a beautiful piece by Debussy called Clair de Lune. They are your maps for the future." Leo held the recorder as if it were made of glass. "You recorded them? When?" "When I still could," she said simply. "They're not perfect, my hands. They weren't listening to me so well at the end. But the heart of the music is there. You'll learn them. And when you do, you'll play them better than I ever did." It was a passing of the torch. David had to look away, blinking hard. "I don't want new maps," Leo said, his voice trembling. "I want you to be my teacher." Clara reached out with her good hand and found his cheek. Her thumb brushed away a tear he hadn't known had fallen. "I will always be your teacher," she whispered. "Now, play for me. Play our piece. All of it." With David's help, Leo set up the keyboard. He found the lighthouse, positioned his hands. He took a deep, shaking breath. And then he began. He played Lay On from beginning to end. It wasn't a flawless performance. A note was missed here. A rhythm wavered there. But what flowed from the small speakers was undeniably, breathtakingly music. It had the loneliness, the ripple, the melancholic beauty Clara had described. He played the footsteps in the snow. He played the nodding answer. He played the feeling of water dot when the last note faded, the room was silent. Clara was crying, but she was smiling too, a wide, beautiful smile that erased the lines of illness from her face. "That," she said, her voice choked with emotion, "is the most beautiful thing I have ever heard." A week later, the call came. It was the professor. His name was Henry. He had a deep, gravelly voice. "I got your message," he said. "Tell me about the boy. And tell me about this teacher of his." David told him. He told him about the secret lessons, about the lighthouse, about the porches, about the hospital, and about the recorder full of heart. There was a long silence on the other end. "Bring him to me," Henry said finally. "Next Tuesday. And if she's up for a visitor, I'd like to meet his first teacher too." The following Saturday was Clara's last day at the rehab center. David and Leo came, but they were not alone. With them was Henry, a tall, stooped man with a wild mane of white hair and kind eyes behind thick glasses. Clara, sitting in her chair dressed in her best lavender sweater, looked at the stranger warily. "Clara, this is Henry," David said. "He's agreed to be Leo's new teacher." Henry stepped forward. He didn't offer a handshake she couldn't easily return. He simply gave a small, respectful nod. "It is an honor to meet you," he said. "I have heard about your methods. The lighthouse. The porches. It is brilliant pedagogy. You've given him something I could not have given him in 100 lessons. You've made the piano a living, touchable world. My job will be to build the theory on top of that world, to give him the words for what he already feels." Clara's wariness softened into guarded hope. "You can do that? With your foundation?" Henry said. "Absolutely. And I have the resources, the Braille scores, the technology. Thanks to a small fund David's story has helped start at the community college." David looked surprised. He hadn't known about a fund. Henry smiled. "I made a few calls of my own." "Your story?" It inspired people. But the real gift came that evening. The community center, where Henry sometimes lectured, had a small auditorium with a good piano. Henry had arranged something. "It's not a recital," David explained to Leo, his heart pounding with nervous excitement. "It's just playing for a few people who want to listen. Clara will be there." They helped Clara into the hall. About 20 people were scattered in the seats, a few friends David had told, some of Henry's colleagues, a couple of curious neighbors. The lights were low. On the stage was a grand piano. Henry led Leo up the few steps and guided him to the bench. Leo's hands found the edges of the grand, so much bigger than his keyboard at home. He reached up searching, and there, clipped to the music stand, was his brass lighthouse. David had fixed it there earlier. Leo's fingers brushed it, and his body relaxed. He was home. He didn't speak. He just positioned his hands, took a breath that echoed in the quiet room, and began to play. He played Lay On. Under his hands, in this big space, on this real instrument, the music bloomed. It filled the auditorium. The water rippled, the memories echoed, the lonely footsteps walked. He played it for Clara, for his father, for the strange new teacher, and for himself. He played it perfectly. As the final notes hung in the air, there was a moment of pure silence. Then the small audience burst into applause. Leo, startled, turned his head toward the sound, a look of wonder on his face. But David was looking at Clara. She was in the front row, sitting tall in her wheelchair. She wasn't clapping. Her good hand was pressed over her heart. Her face was wet with tears, but it was radiant with a joy so profound it made her look young again. She was looking not at the stage, but in the direction of the beautiful sound, as if she could see the music itself, shining in the air. David finally understood what had followed. It wasn't just a skill, or a charity, or a new teacher. It was a boy, once careful and quiet, now sitting tall before a crowd, unafraid. It was an old woman, whose hands were still, but whose heart had poured a world into a child. It was a love for music that had become a bridge between them, strong enough to hold them all. The father hadn't expected this unbreakable cord of connection, this legacy of sound built in secret, now given freely to the world. But as the applause washed over his son's smiling, proud face, he knew it was the most beautiful thing he would ever hear.